Hi YouTube, it's Kathy and this is my weekly entertainment wrap up for January 19th through 25th. This week I read 3 books, I watched 3 shows, I watched 1 movie, and I listened to 2 audiobooks. First this week I finished a buddy read with Jean of Girls of Storm and Shadow. This is the second in Natasha and Ngan's Girls of Paper and Fire series, at least that's what the first book was called. I don't know if that's the series name. Obviously being the second book there's not a whole lot I can tell you about the specific plot because obviously spoilers for the first book, but this book had kind of a different tone. And I have this habit of going right into the second book in a series without refreshing myself on the first book in a series, so there were a lot of characters in this that I was like, wait, did I meet this person before? Who is this person again? And I mostly got it. The book was really good at reminding you who characters were and that type of thing. But again, you should probably go into a book remembering who all the characters were. That's just a good life goal for me because I currently don't do that. Even though this was very fast-paced, it also felt like it was really difficult to get through. Not that I wasn't enjoying it, but just that it felt like it was taking forever to get on to whatever the next point was. And I know that it took Jean much longer than our buddy read to finish it, if she's even finished it at this point. I do, however, want to find out what happens in the next book because of course we are left on somewhat of a cliffhanger. The next book I read this week was a reread because there is a reread space on the Radio Shelves bingo board, and I think we all know that I want to tick off as many things as possible, and that was Big Mushy Happy Lump by Sarah Andersen. This is a graphic novel. You've probably seen some of her graphic spreads on the internet before. She is fairly prolific and she is very funny and very relatable to me because she's an introvert, she likes books, she has anxiety. All of the things, she writes them and draws them hilariously, and I absolutely love this, so it was a lot of fun to go back and reread this. This week I also finished The Devil's Dictionary, and I highly don't suggest reading this cover to cover. In fact, I read it all the way through the introduction up until M, and then at that point I just started skimming the entries for ones that I wanted to read and finished the book that way this week because I started this at the beginning of the month and put it down because reading a dictionary to cover, it's just not a really good time, even if it is this type of dictionary. All of these entries were in newspapers decades ago and they're kind of sarcastic definitions for words. A lot of them are chauvinistic and anti-woman, so those ones were definitely not fun to read. A lot of them were witty and clever and interesting, and then some were just so overly verbose with terminology that we don't use these days or that I'm not familiar with, and I was lost in some of the definitions and they weren't funny because of that. It is interesting to note that in the introduction it did say that this author did work as a devil for some time. It has something to do with journalism, but they didn't explain what a devil is, so I still have no idea what his job actually entailed when he was a so-called devil. And I just really haven't cared enough to use our good friend Google. On to the shows I watched. My roommate and I watched some more Australian Survivor. They've merged, some fun things are happening, there's idols in play, all of those good things. This continues to be a fun time. My friend Steph and I, who is the co-host for Radio Shelves, also started watching Looking for Alaska. I'm really enjoying it so far. We got about 3 episodes in, so we'll probably watch 3 this week and then maybe the last 4 next week, depending on how our schedules go. But it's interesting because I haven't read this book since 2013 and she recently started rereading it. Side note, the audiobook is read by Will Wheaton, so I might have to reread it that way because why not? In any case, a lot of the details aren't exactly fresh in my mind, but they are fresh in hers, and she was talking about how the first episode was like completely true to the book, and then it started veering out from there, not in terrible directions, but obviously with any adaptation you're going to have little changes or things are going to be out of order, and I'm perfectly okay with that. I'm really enjoying this adaptation so far. Another adaptation for another book I read a while ago is The Expanse. Chad and I watched the first 4 episodes of that, and it's interesting because I only read the first book of this series because I originally thought it was a trilogy and then I found out it was 9 books and I went, nope, ain't nobody got time for that. But I thought I didn't really remember anything from this book, and as things were happening on the screen just before they would happen or just as they were happening, I would remember reading about them in the book, so that's a really interesting experience so far. Obviously we'll eventually get to episodes that are past where I read, or there will be certain things that'll come up that I don't know if I've read that before, such as there seems to be kind of 3 major settings, or at least characters that we're following, and there's a 3rd set of characters that I don't really remember, but that could have been later in the book that we actually met them, or we maybe didn't meet them until the 2nd book, or maybe they were a much smaller part in the books. I don't know. I'm eventually going to remember or not. Who knows? knows, but I am very much enjoying this space series. The movie I watched this week was 3.5 hours long, and the starting sequence was a very long shot, which is one of my favorite cinematic features, and that was The Irishman. I didn't know what this was going into it just looked like it had a bunch of actors in it that I know and wanted to see in a movie together, and eventually I got to the point where I was like, I'm going to have to look this up afterward on the movie to see if this is correct to history whatsoever, because this has to do with Jimmy Hoffa, who is a historical figure that I think that everybody has heard of but doesn't necessarily know about. All I really know is he's some guy that went missing and we don't know where his body is. But apparently a little over a decade ago there was a book written called I Hear You Paint Houses about this guy called the Irishman, who was kind of Jimmy Hoffa's bodyguard of sorts and did a lot of murders for mob people, basically. And since he's kind of the only one that's still alive, or at least was at that point, he kind of told this journalist his story, it got published. We don't really know if he's lying or not, or if he's misremembering. There are a lot of theories floating around that some of it's true, or none of it's true, or all of it's true. It was interesting to see this movie. It was interesting to see how the actors portraying the characters didn't really care if it was 100% what happened, just because they felt it was an interesting story. It was an interesting story. It was a little bit too long. There were definitely some conversations that could have been shortened up, for sure, because they have a very roundabout way of speaking to each other, and after you get to like the 12th conversation like that, you just want to go do something else. We actually paused this in the middle of it to go and get wine and come back. Like, leave the house to get a bottle of wine and come back, because this is so long that you definitely need an intermission in the middle, but it was enjoyable. And now, of course, I kind of want to read the book. The first book I listened to this week was The Silent Patient. This was a very cool thriller. I really enjoyed this. I knew absolutely nothing about it going into it, which of course is how I like to go into most books. The premise of this book is there's this therapist who has always felt drawn to help this one specific patient at this one specific facility, and eventually gets a job there to do just that. She, 6 years previously, shot and killed her husband, but hasn't said a word since, and he feels like he can help her. That in itself is a very intriguing premise, and then all of the little details that surround this story also just draw you in, such as he's having some problems at home with his wife and whether or not she knows about some of his activities and wondering what she's up to when she's not rehearsing the play that she's in. And then we also have these diary entries from back before Alyssa killed her husband, and some intrigue as to whether or not she actually did it. Which, if you're anything like me, you kind of always want to believe, even if all of the facts are in front of you going, nah, she probably did do it, but all of these red herrings are very intriguing. She is also an artist, so there's lots to do with artistry and the paintings she did leading up to this event, and a painting she did quite feverishly right after the event. And then of course this also ties in with Greek tragedy, because why not? And it was so good. There is a twist that comes, and I only saw it coming at the beginning of the chapter that it's confirmed, and I was so excited by it. It was such an intriguing twist, very much enjoyed. And then I immediately messaged Jessie from Bow Ties and Books because I know that they have read it, and apparently they screamed when that happened. So it's a good one. This week I also listened to One of Us Is Next by Karen M. McManus. This is the sequel to One of Us Is Lying. In the first book, there were 5 people that went into detention and only 4 came out, and we had to figure out which one of the 4 killed the 5th. In this one, it takes place after that, and it takes place around different characters. There's only 3 main characters to this, but they are characters who are in or around the lives of the previous characters, so you do see the other characters kind of come in and out, and you see what's going on with them, and you hear echoes of what happened in the past with that first murder situation. And then this was just as much fun. It's weird to say murder situation and fun in the same sentence, but that's what happens when you talk about thrillers on the internet. I don't think I like this one quite as much as I liked the first one, because I think that the big twist in the first one I liked a lot more and was a much bigger twist to me, although there is quite a twist in this one as well. I think I just like to be surprised, and I was definitely surprised by both of these books, and then really had admiration for the final twist at the end of this book, because it really draws some things into perspective and was quite delicious, actually. That's it for this week. If you've read, watched, or listened to any of these, let me know about it down in the comments below. On the way down to the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!